What if the first kings of Earth never said they invented their throne, but only that they inherited it? Beneath the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, where water channels once brought order to wild lands, clay tablets still keep a memory older than empire. Each mark pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago carried the weight of something passed down. These were records not of winning, but of taking over, of stepping into a world already measured, already ruled, already complete. So before the silence grows deeper, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're interested in histories that question what we think we know about beginnings. And if you're still listening, leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I'd like to imagine this quiet moment stretching across the world as the past whispers through the present. The story begins not with invention, but with digging things up. In 1849, British diplomat Austin Henry Layard uncovered pieces of cuneiform tablets near the ancient city of Nineveh, among the ruins of collapsed libraries. He found something that should not have existed: a list of kings who ruled before the Great Flood, their reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. The document was plain and businesslike, written in the same record-keeping style used for grain stores and temple inventories. It was called the Sumerian King List, and it opened with words that still shake up the timeline we've built for ourselves. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Not invented, not seized, not earned, descended. The tablet did not describe humans claiming power for the first time. It described them receiving an office that already existed, passed down from rulers whose names appeared alongside impossible reign lengths. 43,200 years for one king. 36,000 for another. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain those numbers away as symbols, as exaggerations, as mistakes. But the scribes did not treat them as symbols. They recorded these reigns in the same tone they used to measure barley and count cattle. No mythological decoration, no divine poetry, just names, cities, and durations listed as though copying from an archive they believed to be real. And then the flood arrived. The list marks it clearly, a dividing line between one age and another. After the waters went away, kingship returned. But the numbers changed. Post-flood rulers lived normal human lifespans. The tone shifted from cosmic administration to human government. Something had ended. Something had been lost. When archaeologists dug up the cities mentioned in the King List, Eridu, Uruk, Shuruppak, they found physical evidence of terrible flooding around 2900 BC. Layers of clean mud, interrupting settlement debris, rebuilding efforts on top of older foundations. The flood was not mythological convenience. It was geological fact. But here is where the silence begins to hum with meaning. The cities rebuilt after the flood were not primitive restarts. They carried forward advanced irrigation systems, astronomical alignments, mathematical frameworks based on BASC 60, counting the same system that still governs our measurement of time. Writing appeared not as crude picture symbols struggling toward language, but as a fully formed script capable of recording law, medicine, and planetary movements. In one temple archive at Nippur, diggers found administrative texts describing the rebuilding of sacred structures. Among the dedication inscriptions, a phrase appeared that changes everything. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not foundation, not innovation, restoration. The word implies memory. It implies models. It implies that what we call the birth of civilization might have been, to those who built it, an act of reconstruction. Hold that thought for a moment. Imagine you are a scribe in ancient Uruk, pressing reeds into soft clay beneath the shadow of a ziggurat that rises in step layers toward the stars. You are recording a king's decree, but your training did not come from trial and error. It came from copying older tablets, which themselves were copied from tablets older still. Your calendar divides the year according to moon cycles calculated with precision. Your mathematics can predict eclipses. Your medical texts describe surgical procedures. And when you wonder where this knowledge began, your teachers tell you it was given, not discovered. Given by whom? The texts name the Manu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. In Sumerian records, these beings are not distant creators dwelling in abstraction. They are administrators, judges, measurers of time, assigners of cities and domains. The language describing them lacks the reverence of worship. It reads more like bureaucracy, officials governing territories, settling disputes, establishing laws. The Anunnaki in the earliest Sumerian sources, before later myths layered divinity upon them, appear as governors of a structured world. They do not perform miracles. They allocate resources. They do not inspire hymns. They issue decrees. And then, after the flood, they withdraw. Not destroyed, not overthrown, simply absent. And humanity continues alone, guided only by the memory of an order they believe was not originally theirs to create. This is not the story of gods in the way we imagine gods. This is the story of inheritance of civilizations that never claimed to be first, but only to be what survived. From Sumer to Egypt, from the Indus Valley to Mesoamerica, cultures describe the same pattern: an earlier age of non-human governance, a catastrophic division, and humanity rebuilding in the aftermath. What changes is the names. What remains constant is the memory of succession. So the question emerges quietly, like dust settling after excavation: if humans did not invent civilization, then who did the ancients believe ruled before them? The ancient records. The answer begins in a museum basement in Istanbul, where a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle sits behind reinforced glass. It was discovered in 1906 by German archaeologist Hermann Hilpert, buried beneath the ruins of Nippur's temple library. The prism's 4 sides contain 18 columns of cuneiform text, a complete version of the Sumerian king list, copied around 2100 BC from sources the scribe himself described as ancient. When Hilpert first translated the opening lines, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes, uncertain whether he had made an error. Because the text did not describe the beginning of human rule, it described its resumption. The language is unnervingly precise. Before listing mortal kings with recognizable reign lengths 23 years, 18 years, 36 years, the scribe records something else entirely: 5 cities, 8 rulers. Reign lengths that span epochs: 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Then a single sentence divides the entire chronicle. Then the flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. Cities rebuild. New dynasties emerge. But the reign links return to human scale. The cosmic administration ends. What follows is recognizable history: flawed kings, short reigns, dynastic struggles. But what came before carries the weight of something the scribe could not invent and would not dismiss. This is not mythology dressed as history. This is history struggling to preserve something it inherited but could not fully explain. When archaeologists began systematic excavations across southern Mesopotamia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they expected to find the gradual evolution of civilization: crude villages slowly developing into towns, towns into cities, simplicity into complexity. That is how progress is supposed to work. Instead, they found Uruk. The city appeared in the archaeological record around 3500 BC, as if stepping out of shadow, fully formed. 6 mil defensive walls constructed from millions of mud bricks. The white temple rising on a platform 40 feet high, its corners aligned to cardinal directions with surveyor-level precision. Cylinder seals depicting complex religious imagery. Administrative tablets recording grain distribution, labor assignments, and tribute payments in a writing system already mature enough to handle abstract concepts. There was no apprenticeship period, no evidence of experimentation. The pottery was wheel-thrown and mass-produced. The architecture was monumental and geometrically sophisticated. The bureaucracy was literate and organized. Archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades translating Sumerian tablets, called it history's first sudden civilization. The phrase itself reveals the discomfort. Civilizations are not supposed to be sudden. Yet here one stood, leaving behind more questions than the scholars who unearthed it knew how to answer. The tablets themselves add to the strangeness. They were not casual records or personal journals. There were archives: thousands upon thousands of clay documents fired hard to resist time, carefully stored in temple libraries and administrative centers. Whoever created this writing system understood impermanence. They understood that stone erodes, wood burns, and memory fades. So they chose clay abundant and eternal when properly baked. And they wrote as though they were preserving something that might otherwise be lost forever. One tablet from Nippur, catalogued as CBS 10673, contains a hymn to the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing and grain. The hymn does not celebrate writing as a recent human achievement. Instead, it describes Nisaba as having opened the house of learning and revealed the me, a Sumerian concept, referring to the fundamental principles governing civilization, which existed before humans practiced them. The me were not invented. They were discovered, or more accurately, remembered. Another text from the same archive lists the me in detail: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of metalwork, the art of leatherwork, the art of building, wisdom, fear, strife, victory, counseling, judgment, decision-making. Over 100 fundamental elements of civilized existence, each treated not as something humans develop through trial and error, but as something already complete, waiting to be accessed. The emotional tone is unmistakable recovery, not innovation. The astronomy mystery. And then there is the astronomy. In 1881, Jesuit scholar Joseph Epping began translating a series of clay tablets from Babylon that recorded the movements of Venus over a 21-year period. The observations were attributed to the reign of King Amisaduqa around 1650 BC, but the accuracy suggested much older source material. The tablets predicted Venus's appearances and disappearances with precision that required centuries of continuous observation, tracking patterns that repeat only every 584 days, calculating retrograde motion, noting heliacal risings. This was not primitive stargazing. This was mathematical astronomy. The Sumerians divided the sky into the zodiac we still use. They calculated the lunar month too within fractions of a second of modern measurements. They knew the orbital periods of the visible planets and encoded them into a sexagesimal system base 60, which governs our division of hours into minutes, minutes into seconds, circles into 360 degrees. Where did that system come from? Not from counting on fingers, not from organic development. It appeared complete, embedded in the earliest mathematical tablets, used for everything from surveying fields to predicting eclipses. It feels less like invention and more like inheritance from a culture that understood deep time. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the Sumerians themselves never claimed to be first. In temple foundation inscriptions, kings described their building projects not as original creations, but as restorations. I rebuilt the temple as it was in ancient days. I returned the sacred structure to its former glory. Even in their moment of apparent genesis, they spoke as though they were recovering what had been. The word they used most often was gibel, to renew, to restore, to make as it was before. But for what? That question hangs in the silence between excavation layers, in the gap between the impossible reign lengths and immortal dynasties that followed, in the precision of knowledge that appeared without precedent. The Sumerians built their cities on top of older tells, artificial mounds, formed from centuries of collapsed settlements. Beneath the earth, archaeologists found 18 distinct occupation layers stretching back beyond 5000 BC. Beneath Eridu, the city the king lists names as the first seat of kingship, excavators discovered temple foundations built and rebuilt 16 times, each new structure carefully aligned on top the ruins of the last, as though maintaining an unbroken sacred geometry across millennia. Someone was there before. The earth remembers, even if the names have been forgotten. And if the Sumerians were inheriting rather than inventing, if they were remembering rather than discovering, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who were the rulers they believed governed this world before human kings took the throne? Who were the Anunnaki? In the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, a small clay tablet designated WB 444 rests in climatic-controlled storage. It measures roughly 4 inches tall, 3 inches wide, small enough to hold comfortably in one hand. The surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus sometime around 2000 BC. Unlike the grand royal monuments or temple dedications, this tablet is administrative in nature, a list, a record, the kind of document a bureaucrat might consult when verifying the succession of authority. It begins with the phrase that has troubled historians for more than a century. Namwigal anta diba. In Sumerian, this translates directly as when kingship was lowered from heaven. Not established by humans, not earned through conquest, not inherited from mortal ancestors, lowered, as though rulership itself existed before anyone on earth claimed it, residing somewhere above until the moment it descended to the first city. The scribe who pressed these words into clay was not writing poetry. The tablet continues in the same flat administrative tone used throughout Mesopotamian record-keeping lists of grain stores, temple inventories, land measurements. Yet embedded within this bureaucratic language is an assertion that destabilizes everything we assume about the origin of political power. The king list treats kingship as an office that predates its occupants. After establishing that kingship descended from heaven, the text immediately identifies where it landed, Eridu, the first city. And it names the first recipient Alulum. Then it records his reign length. 28,800 years. The number sits there on the clay, wedged between the name of the city and the name of the next king, as matter of fact as a harvest total. No explanation, no qualification, just a duration so impossibly long it forces a choice: either dismiss the entire document as fantasy, or accept that the scribes were recording something they believe to be factually true, even if the meaning has become unclear across millennia. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Meluana, 43,200 years. 5 cities. 8 kings. Reign lengths that span geological epochs, recorded in the same clinical style used for counting sheep and measuring barley. Then the flood arrives, marked with the same administrative brevity. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The language mirrors the opening line exactly: kingship lowered from heaven. But now it happens a second time, as though the office had been withdrawn during the catastrophe and then reinstated afterward. What returns, however, is fundamentally different. The first post-flood king, Gaer, ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by human standards, but a fraction of the pre-flood reigns. His successor, Gulanitabonapit, ruled 960 years. The numbers continue to decrease through successive dynasties until, by the time the list reaches historically verifiable kings like Gilgamesh, reign lengths settle into human lifespans: 21 years, 36 years, 15 years. The transition is gradual but unmistakable. Something changed after the flood. The cosmic administration diminished. Mortality reasserted itself. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations for these numbers. Perhaps they represent dynastic totals rather than individual reigns. Perhaps they're symbolic, encoding astronomical cycles or mythological ages. Perhaps later scribes inflated earlier reigns to grant them divine authority. But none of these explanations account for the precision with which the numbers are recorded, nor the systematic way they decrease. If the figures were purely symbolic, why the careful mathematical progression? If they were political propaganda, why present them in such dry, unembellished language? The scribe offers no commentary, no divine intervention narrative, no miraculous events justifying the impossible durations, just names, cities, and numbers copied from older sources. The scribe himself could no longer fully contextualize, but refused to alter. One detail stands out in the structure of the list itself. Before each pre-flood king, the text uses the Sumerian word Lugil king, but it also frequently pairs it with the determinative sign for divinity. After the flood, this pairing becomes inconsistent, then disappears entirely. The office remains the same. The title remains the same. But the nature of those who hold it shifts from divine to human. Kingship did not change. The kings did. This is not a creation myth. Creation myths explain origins through divine action, gods shaping clay, breathing life, speaking worlds into existence. The Sumerian king list does none of this. It simply records succession, as though documenting the transfer of an administrative office from one regime to another. And when it describes who held authority before the flood, the text occasionally adds another layer of information. Several versions of the king list include marginal notes or parallel texts that identify these early rulers not just by name, but by category. They are called Anunnaki, a term that appears thousands of times across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature. In later myths, the Anunnaki become gods of the underworld, divine judges, cosmic legislators. But in the earliest references, the term carries a more functional meaning. The word itself breaks down as Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, or offspring of Anu being the sky god who represents cosmic order and authority. They are not described with the language of worship. They are not invoked in prayers. Instead, they appear in administrative contexts, allocating cities, assigning domains, measuring time, establishing laws. Their role resembles governance, not divinity in the spiritual sense. One Sumerian text, the debate between winter and summer, describes the Anunnaki decreeing the agricultural calendar. Another, the Ritu Genesis, portrays them deciding the fate of humanity before the flood. In the Descent of Inanna, they sit in judgment as a council. In temple hymns, they're called the great gods who decree destinies, but the destinies they decree are terrestrial harvest yields, water rights, territorial boundaries. The tone is civil administration, not cosmic mystery. And here the silence grows heavy with implication. If kingship was an office that descended from heaven, and if the Anunnaki were the administrators who first held it, then the Sumerian king list is not recording mythology. It is recording a transition of governance from non-human rulers to human ones, marked by catastrophe and measured in the gradual shortening of lifespans. The scribes who maintained these lists across centuries treated them as legitimate historical records. They copied them into royal archives, referenced them in legal disputes over dynastic succession, and used them to establish territorial claims. The king list was not religious literature. It was constitutional documentation, which raises the unavoidable question: who were the beings set to govern before human kings, and why were they remembered as rulers, not gods? The administrators. In 1912, University of Pennsylvania archaeologist George Barton published a translation of a clay tablet excavated from the ancient city of Lagash. The tablet, dated to approximately 2400 BC, contained a legal dispute over water rights between two neighboring temple estates. The text described conflicting claims to an irrigation canal, outlined testimony from witnesses, and then recorded the resolution. At the bottom of the tablet, beneath the judgment, appeared a single phrase that seemed oddly out of place in an otherwise mundane legal proceeding. The Anunnaki, the great gods, have made this decision binding. Not as divine intervention, not as supernatural enforcement, but as administrative authority, the final court of appeal in a bureaucratic hierarchy. The tablet treated the Anunnaki the same way a modern document might reference a supreme court or governing council. Their judgment was invoked not because they performed miracles, but because their jurisdiction was recognized as absolute. This is how the Anunnaki appear in the oldest Sumerian sources, not as objects of worship, but as functionaries of order. The term occurs more than 2,000 times across cuneiform literature spanning nearly 3 millennia. Yet in the earliest texts, those written before 2000 BC, before centuries of mythological elaboration, the Anunnaki are described with remarkable consistency. They measure, they decree, they allocate, they judge. They govern the mechanisms by which civilization operates. The Instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest pieces of Sumerian wisdom literature dating to around 2600 BC, contains practical advice from a father to his son. Among instructions about honesty, hard work, and respect for elders, one line stands out. The Anunnaki have determined your fate. Do not alter the water channel. The phrasing is instructive. Determining fate and maintaining water channels are mentioned in the same breath, as though they are related acts of governance. Fate, in this context, is not mystical destiny, but civic allocation: who receives water, who controls land, who bears responsibility for maintaining infrastructure. This is the language of administration, not theology. Another text from roughly the same period, a temple hymn from Nippur, describes the god Enlil, chief among the Anunnaki, as he who makes the hoe and the plow abundant not through divine magic, but through the establishment of agricultural order. The hymn continues, he set the holy measuring rod, the measuring line. These are surveying tools, engineering instruments, the kind of implements used to plant cities, dig canals, and divide fields. Enlil's power is described through infrastructure. In the Sumerian temple hymns compiled around 2300 BC, individual Anunnaki are associated with specific cities and specific functions. Enki is described as lord of Eridu and overseer of freshwater and wisdom. Ninhursag governs birth and fertility. Nana measures the lunar calendar. Uda regulates justice and trade. These are portfolios, jurisdictions. Each Anunnaki governs a domain essential to civilization's operation. And the early texts describe them exercising that governance in practical terrestrial ways. One cylinder seal from the Ur period, around 3200 BC, shows a scene that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. A robed figure stands before a group of kneeling humans, gesturing toward a diagram that appears to represent a city plan or irrigation system. Above the scene, symbols indicate divine authority, but the image itself depicts instruction, teaching not worship. The figure is not receiving offerings. The humans are not prostrate in fear. The entire composition suggests a transfer of knowledge, a delegation of responsibility. This pattern repeats across hundreds of early texts and artifacts, the Anunnaki as architects of order, who interact with humanity not as distant creators, but as present administrators establishing systems that humans are then expected to maintain. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest flood narratives, describes the world before catastrophe as a place where the Anunnaki were born and cities were built. It lists 5 cities Eridu, Batabir, Larak, Sippar, and Sharapak, and assigns each to the care of a specific Anunnaki. The text uses the word Garza, which translates as divine power, but functionally means something closer to administrative responsibility or office. Each city was a jurisdiction. Each Anunnaki was an administrator. What distinguishes these early references from later mythology is the absence of supernatural embellishment. The Anunnaki do not hurl thunderbolts. They do not transform themselves into animals. They do not battle cosmic monsters. Instead, they allocate resources, settle disputes, regulate time, and maintain boundaries between order and chaos. In Sumerian cosmology, chaos is represented by Abzu, the subterranean waters, and Tiamat, the salt sea. Both are forces that must be controlled, channeled, and measured to sustain civilization. Enki's primary function is governance over the Abzu, ensuring fresh water flows through canals, rather than flooding settlements. This is hydraulic engineering framed in cosmic terms. The boundary between mythology and memory becomes difficult to locate. Consider the debate between sheep and grain, a Sumerian text that personifies agricultural resources as deities. The narrative describes a time before sheep and grain existed, when humans knew not the eating of bread, and walked on all fours eating grass. Then the Anunnaki create sheep and grain, teaching humans to weave, bake, and farm. Stripped of personification, the text describes the introduction of domesticated agriculture, the transition from hunter-gatherer existence to settled farming. The Anunnaki are credited not with creating life itself, but with organizing it into productive systems. They are innovators, perhaps engineers, possibly but always. In these early texts, they are present, active, terrestrial. Then something changes. The withdrawal. The Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BC but drawn from older sources, describes a crisis in the divine order. Humanity has multiplied beyond control. The noise of civilization disturbs the Anunnaki. Enlil decrees a solution flood. But here is the crucial detail often overlooked: the flood is not punishment for human sin. It is described as a practical measure to reduce population pressure. The language is administrative, even coldly pragmatic. And after the waters recede, the Anunnaki do not return to direct governance. Instead, they establish new parameters. Human lifespans are shortened. Fertility is limited. A buffer is created between the divine administrators and the human population. The text describes this as a treaty, a negotiated settlement between two parties who can no longer coexist in close proximity. The Anunnaki withdraw not in death, not in defeat, but in deliberate separation, stepping back from active governance and leaving humanity to maintain the systems they established. Later texts, Babylonian, Assyrian, and subsequent retellings transform the Anunnaki into underworld deities, cosmic judges, and abstract forces of fate. The functional details fade. The mythology thickens. By the time these stories reach Greek and Roman interpreters, the Anunnaki are unrecognizable, reduced to planetary gods and astrological symbols. But the earliest sources remember them differently, as governors who measured time, allocated land, regulated water, established law, and taught agriculture, as administrators of an ordered world, who, for reasons the texts struggle to articulate, could no longer remain present. The Sumerian king list marks the transition clearly. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven a second time, but now it belongs to humans. The reigns return to mortal scale. The cosmic administration ends. What the texts preserve is not the moment the Anunnaki arrived, but the moment they departed, leaving behind cities, laws, calendars, and a haunting sense that the world was once governed more carefully than it is now. The flood evidence. If the Anunnaki once ruled openly, what event marked the end of their governance? In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur, when his workers struck something unexpected beneath the tombs, a layer of clean, water-laid silt, 11 feet thick, sterile and uniform, containing no pottery shards, no ash, no evidence of human habitation. Beneath this barren stratum lay the ruins of an earlier settlement, crushed mud brick walls, collapsed roofs, fragments of painted pottery from a style that had vanished from the archaeological record. Above the silt, civilization resumed. Below it, an older world ended. Woolley telegraphed the British Museum with a message that made international headlines: "We have found the flood." The claim was dramatic, perhaps too dramatic, but the physical evidence was undeniable. At some point around 2900 BC, a catastrophic inundation had buried the ancient city beneath sediment deposited by massive water flow. The layer was too thick to result from seasonal flooding, too uniform to be localized. And critically, it marked a clear discontinuity in material culture. What came after was different from what came before. Woolley's discovery was not isolated. The Kish excavations revealed a similar flood layer, 18 inches thick, dated to approximately the same period. At Shuruppak, the city where, according to the Eridu Genesis, the flood heroes Isutra ruled as king, archaeologists found evidence of violent inundation, interrupting occupation around 2900 BC. At Uruk, stratigraphic analysis showed a gap in settlement continuity, coinciding with widespread flooding across the Mesopotamian plain. The geological record confirmed what the clay tablets had been saying for 4,000 years: the flood was not metaphor. It was stratigraphy. But here is where the ancient texts diverged sharply from later interpretations. The Sumerian flood narratives, the Eridu Genesis and the fragmentary Deluge tablet, found at Nippur, described the event not as divine punishment for human wickedness, but as something closer to environmental catastrophe. The gods do not rage against human sin. They debate administrative policy. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil proposes the flood because humanity's noise has become unbearable, not morally offensive, but literally disruptive to cosmic order. The solution is presented as practical, even bureaucratic: reduce the population, restore balance, reset the system. There's no more lark, no redemption narrative. Just the cold logic of governance facing an unsustainable situation. The hero who survives, called Isutra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, is warned by the god Enki, who appears to operate outside Enlil's authority. Enki instructs the hero to build a boat, seal it with bitumen, and load it with representatives of living things. The instructions are precise, technical, the kind of details someone would need to actually construct a waterproof vessel. When the flood arrives, the text describes it not with thunder and divine wrath, but with silence. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm swept over the land. The great gods looked on in dismay. Dismay. Not satisfaction, not righteous judgment. The Anunnaki, described watching the destruction they decreed, but the tone suggests something closer to regret than vindication. One passage in the Atrahasis epic depicts the goddess Ninhursag weeping as she witnesses the obliteration of cities she helped establish. This is not the flood of later biblical tradition, where divine justice cleanses a corrupt world. This is abandonment, withdrawal, the ending of an age not through moral necessity, but through calculated decision. And when the waters recede, something fundamental has shifted. The Eridu Genesis describes Isutra offering sacrifice after the flood subsides. The Anunnaki accept the offering, but they do not resume direct governance. Instead, the text records a covenant of formal agreement establishing new boundaries. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but under different conditions. Lifespans will be shortened. Divnahuman proximity will be reduced. The world will be managed at a distance. The Sumerian king list captures this transition with mathematical precision. Before the flood, 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, direct divine administration. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time, but now to human rulers whose lifespans decrease systematically through successive dynasties. The first post-flood king, Gair of Kish, ruled 1,200 years, still superhuman, but a fraction of the pre-flood durations. His dynasty's reigns declined steadily: 960 years, 840 years, 720 years. By the first dynasty of Uruk, reign lengths dropped to double digits. By the time the list reaches historically verifiable kings, the numbers are fully human: 18 years, 36 years, 25 years. The progression suggests not mythological inflation, but a gradual return to mortal parameters as, though some quality that once extended life was slowly dissipating, fading with distance from the pre-flood age. What the scribes recorded was not fantasy, but the memory of a threshold crossed before the flood. The world operated under one set of conditions, after it, under another. The flood layers themselves tell a story of sudden violence followed by patient rebuilding. Above Woolley's sterile silt, the city began again. New foundations were laid directly over the flood deposit, but they followed the same orientations as the structures buried below. Streets ran along the same axis. Temple platforms rose on the same sacred ground. The city that emerged was not a fresh start. It was a reconstruction, carefully aligned with the ruined template beneath. At Eridu, excavators found something even more revealing. Beneath the earliest visible temple, designated Temple I by archaeologists, lay 15 older temples, built one on top of another, each destroyed and rebuilt in succession. The lowest levels, dated to before 5000 BC, showed the same architectural plan as the uppermost: a central shrine, an offering table, an altar positioned to face the same direction. Across nearly 3,000 years and 16 iterations, the design never changed. Each generation rebuilt what had been lost, following a pattern they believed was original, sacred, and not theirs to alter. This is inheritance, not innovation. Memory preserved through repetition, even when the memory's origin has faded beyond recall. The flood did not destroy knowledge. It interrupted transmission. What survived were fragments, tablet collections baked hard by fire, buried deep enough to escape looters, carefully archived in temple foundations, where later scribes would find them and copy them into new collections. The Sumerians described themselves as rediscoverers of what was written before, translators of texts whose language was already archaic, interpreters of instructions they followed without fully understanding. One text from the post-flood period, a temple dedication at Lagash, includes a phrase that appears repeatedly in rebuilding inscriptions. I have restored it according to the old writings. Not I have built it as I saw fit, not I have improved upon the past, but according to the old writings. Authority flows backward, toward sources that predate the builders, toward knowledge treated as inheritance rather than achievement. The flood, in this reading, was not the end of the world. It was the end of an administration. The physical world continued. The waters receded. Seeds sprouted. Animals returned. But the governance structure collapsed. The Anunnaki, whether literal administrators or symbolic representatives of a lost order, did not return to active rule. They withdrew into the background, becoming judges rather than governors, observers rather than architects. Humanity was left to maintain systems it had not designed, following blueprints it could copy but not recreate. And in that transition lies a haunting question the texts preserve but cannot answer. If the flood ended direct rule, how did humans rebuild a world they believed was not originally theirs? Building is remembrance. In the Baghdad Museum, before the chaos of recent decades scattered its collections, there stood a brick unlike any other in the archive. It was recovered from the foundation of the Anunnaki ziggurat in Babylon. This structure Greek historians called the Tower of Babel. The brick bore a cuneiform inscription from King Nebuchadnezzar II, dated to around 600 BC, and the text was unexpectedly precise. I have rebuilt the Anunnaki to its ancient height. I raised its top to heaven as it was in former times. Not I have built, not I have created something magnificent, but as it was in former times. Nebuchadnezzar, ruling one of the most powerful empires in human history, described his greatest architectural achievement as an act of restoration. And beneath that brick, archaeologists found evidence he was telling the truth: layers of older foundations extending down through millennia, each iteration built on top the ruins of the last, each following the same 7-year design, the same orientation, the same sacred proportions. The ziggurat was not Nebuchadnezzar's invention. It was his inheritance, and he spent enormous resources ensuring it matched a template he believed was ancient even in his own time. This pattern repeats across every major Mesopotamian city: building as remembrance, architecture as archaeology. The oldest foundation inscription ever discovered comes from Renamu, king of Ur, around 2100 BC, carved into a limestone slab buried beneath the great ziggurat of Ur. The text describes his construction project. After the waters of the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, I rebuilt the temple of Nana as it existed from distant days. The phrasing is careful. Renamu does not claim to have designed the ziggurat. He claims to have replicated something that existed from distant days, from a time before the flood, before his dynasty, before any king whose name he could verify. Excavations beneath the ziggurat confirmed his account. Deep below Renamu's platform, archaeologists found older mudbrick platforms, each carefully dismantled and incorporated into the later structure. The builders did not simply pile new construction on top of old ruins. They excavated, measured, and preserved the ancient alignments before building upward. This was not renovation. It was replication. And the precision was extraordinary. The great ziggurat's corners aligned to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error feet, requiring sophisticated astronomical observation and surveying techniques. Its base measurements follow ratios that appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian architecture, the same proportions used at Eridu, at Nippur, at Uruk. Not because each city copied its neighbors, but because all of them were copying something older. At Eridu, the pattern becomes even more striking. When Iraqi archaeologists excavated the city in the 1940s, they expected to find the usual sequence: modest beginnings gradually developing into monumental architecture. Instead, they discovered something that defied developmental logic. Temple XVI, the deepest, oldest structure at the site, was small but architecturally sophisticated: a rectangular shrine with niches for offerings, an altar platform, a central hearth for sacred fire. Radiocarbon dating placed it around 5400 BC, making it older than the first dynasties, older than writing, older than any known kingship. Above a temple XV, built on exactly the same plan, slightly larger. Above that temple Ziv, again the same design, proportionally expanded. This continued through 18 distinct construction phases, spanning more than 3,000 years. Each temple was ritually buried beneath clean sand before the next was built. Each maintained the same orientation, the same internal layout, the same positioning of the altar. The only thing that changed was scale. The temples grew larger over time, but the sacred geometry remained constant. By the time construction reached Temple I, the visible structure in the historical period, the building had become a massive platform temple. But beneath it lay 17 older versions, each a perfect echo of the first. Someone, at the very beginning, established a pattern, and every subsequent generation maintained it with absolute fidelity even as languages changed, dynasties rose and fell, and the original architects faded into prehistory. The ziggurat form itself embodies this principle. These step pyramids, rising in diminishing tiers toward the sky, were not practical structures. They contained no storage rooms, no defensive positions, no residential quarters. The massive labor investment, millions of mud bricks, decades of construction, entire city populations mobilized produced buildings whose only function was symbolic. They were called the Anunnaki in Sumerian, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The name reveals their purpose. They were not monuments to kings or tributes to gods. They were architectural links between terrestrial and cosmic order, physical representations of a cosmological model that treated heaven and earth as mirrored domains requiring connection. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes this explicitly. After establishing cosmic order, the gods command, "Let us build a shrine, a recess for his abode. When we arrive, we shall find rest therein." The ziggurat was the earthly counterpart to a heavenly template. And if that template existed first in the divine realm, then every ziggurat built on earth was, by definition, a copy, maintenance, not creation. The astronomical alignments reinforce this conclusion. Ziggurat's corners mark the cardinal points with precision that requires deliberate calculation. At Uruk, the White Temple sits atop a platform oriented 15 degrees off cardinal north, an angle that precisely matches the tilt of the ancient city's street grid, suggesting the entire urban plan followed a predetermined astronomical framework. At Babylon, the Anunnaki 7 tiers were associated with the 7 classical planets, each level painted a different color corresponding to planetary symbolism: black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars. This was not decorative choice. It was cosmological mapping, translating celestial hierarchy into architectural form. But here is the disturbing question: how did the earliest builders know these patterns? The oldest ziggurats predate advanced mathematics, predate written astronomy, predate any surviving record of surveying techniques capable of such precision. Yet the alignments are there, embedded in structures from the very beginning of monumental architecture. Either the builders possessed knowledge far beyond what the archaeological record suggests, or they were copying templates they had inherited from an earlier, more sophisticated source. One inscription from the Temple of Ninjutsu at Lagash, dated to around 2050 BC, describes the king Gudea receiving the temple's design in a dream. The goddess Nadaba appears to him holding a lapis lazuli tablet inscribed with the plan of a temple, and she instructs him to build according to the pattern shown. The text is often read as mystical vision, divine inspiration. But read literally, it describes something else: the transmission of pre-existing architectural knowledge through inherited documents, blueprints, preserved from an earlier time, treated as sacred, precisely because their origin was unknown. Gudea does not invent. He consults. He measures. He replicates. And when his temple is complete, he inscribes its foundation with the same phrase that appears on countless Mesopotamian buildings: "I have made it as it was in ancient days." The cities themselves were laid out according to this principle. Uruk street grid, Ur's residential quarters, Nippur's temple district all follow geometries that appear fully formed in the earliest occupation layers. There is no trial and error visible in the archaeological record, no gradual refinement of urban planning. The cities emerge organized, as though following plans that predated their construction. At Nippur, excavators found something particularly revealing: a clay map dated to around 1500 BC, showing the city's layout, parks, gates, temples, and canals all precisely marked. But the map includes structures that had not existed for centuries, buildings destroyed in earlier conflicts, neighborhoods abandoned and buried. The map was not documenting contemporary reality. It was preserving an ideal form of memory of how the city should be arranged, even if later generations could no longer maintain that perfection. This is what defines Mesopotamian civilization: not the ambition to surpass the past, but the discipline to preserve it. Every brick laid in alignment with ancient foundations. Every temple rebuilt on sacred ground. Every ziggurat rising in tiers that mirrored cosmic order. The entire civilization organized around the principle that what mattered most had already been established, and humanity's role was not to innovate, but to remember to maintain what had been given. But that raises the question the texts themselves cannot answer. Where did the knowledge used to rebuild these cities come from? Inherited knowledge. In the British Museum, catalogue number K160 holds a fragment of clay no larger than a smartphone. It was excavated from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh in the mid-19th century, part of a collection spanning thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The tablet is a mathematical text dated to around 1800 BC, but copied from sources the scribe himself identifies as ancient writings from before the flood. The surface contains a geometric problem calculating the diagonal of a rectangle using what we now call the Pythagorean theorem. The solution is presented not as discovery, not as the result of mathematical experimentation, but as established fact. No proof is offered, no derivation shown, just the answer, precise and complete, as though the scribe were copying from a reference manual whose origin he could not trace. Below the calculation, a brief colophon appears. Written according to the old text. Wisdom from the house of Enki. The house of Enki, the god credited with governance over freshwater, wisdom, and what the Sumerians called Namku, the seekers of craft. Not the inventor of mathematics, but its custodian. Not the creator of knowledge, but its transmitter. This is how Mesopotamian texts describe their own intellectual foundations as inheritance, not innovation. The same pattern appears across every domain of advanced knowledge. Writing itself, the technology that made all other knowledge preservation possible, was attributed to the goddess Saba. Temple hymns describe her not as inspiring human invention, but as revealing the tablet and opening the house of learning. The language suggests disclosure of something that already existed, waiting to be accessed. One text from Uruk, dated to approximately 2600 BC, contains a prayer to Nisaba before beginning the scribal exercise. Lady who knows the inmost secrets, who possesses the lapis lazuli tablet, open for me the secrets of your wisdom. The lapis lazuli tablet, a symbolic object representing fixed permanent knowledge, inscribed in stone rather than clay. Knowledge that existed before the scribe, before his teachers, before the institution of writing itself. And indeed, when cuneiform appears in the archaeological record around 3400 BC, it is already systematic, over 1,200 distinct signs capable of representing syllables, words, and abstract concepts. There are no preliminary stages, no simpler proto-scripts showing gradual development. The writing system appears fully functional, immediately employed for complex accounting, legal contracts, and administrative records. Linguist Denise Schmanbesser proposed that cuneiform evolved from clay tokens used for accounting. But the tokens themselves, small geometric shapes representing quantities of grain, animals, or oil, appear suddenly around 3500 BC with no clear predecessors. And the leap from three-dimensional tokens to two-dimensional signs requires conceptual abstraction that should leave developmental traces. Yet none exists. The system appears complete. Astronomy shows the same pattern. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, copied during the reign of a Babylonian king around 1650 BC, records the movements of Venus with astonishing precision. The tablet tracks the planet's heliacal rising and setting over a 21-year period, noting its disappearances behind the sun and reappearances on the horizon. The accuracy requires centuries of continuous observation, tracking a cycle that repeats every 8 years, but shifts against the calendar, requiring long-term pattern recognition. But here is the anomaly: the observations are not presented as recent discoveries. The text explicitly states it was copied from older tablets dating to the first dynasty of Babylon, around 1900 BC, which were themselves copied from earlier sources. One marginal note reads, according to the old observations of Anu and Enlil. Anu and Enlil, two of the principal Anunnaki, credited with celestial knowledge before any human king ruled. The scribes were not claiming to have made these observations themselves. They were preserving them, passing down astronomical data. His origin disappeared into prehistory. The Molopin tablets, dated to around 1000 BC but containing material from at least a millennium earlier, list constellations, star risings, and planetary movements. The text describes the sky with the confidence of long familiarity, not the hesitant observations of pioneers learning to map the heavens, but the refined notation of experts maintaining an inherited catalog. And the mathematics embedded in these astronomical texts is equally sophisticated. BASC 60, counting the sexagesimal system still used to measure time and angles, appears without explanation in the earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets. No simpler BASC 10 precursor exists. No gradual transition from finger counting to abstract mathematics. The system is simply there, fully operational, capable of expressing fractions, calculating areas, and solving algebraic problems. One tablet from Nippur, dated to around 2000 BC, contains a problem involving compound interest, calculating the growth of a loan over multiple years. The solution uses exponential functions, demonstrating mathematical concepts that should not exist without extensive theoretical development. Yet the tablet presents the formula as common knowledge, something any trained scribe would recognize. Medicine follows the same trajectory. The Diagnostic Handbook, attributed to the physician Esagil-Kanapli, dated to around 1000 BC, but drawing on sources centuries older, lists symptoms, diagnoses, and prognoses for dozens of conditions. The text describes physical examinations with clinical precision, checking pulse, observing skin color, noting temperature changes, analyzing excretions. This is empirical medicine, but it appears already systematized, organized into diagnostic categories that suggest lung refinement. And the text attributes its knowledge not to recent physicians, but to Ninurta and Gula, deities associated with healing, who revealed the physician's art to humanity. Legal codes demonstrate the pattern most clearly. The Code of Renamu, dating to around 2100 BC, is often called the world's oldest law code. But the prologue undermines that claim. Renamu describes himself not as the author of law, but as its restorer. After the kingship descended from heaven, after Anu and Enlil had given the city to Nana, I established justice in the land, according to the true word of Udu. Udu, the sun god associated with justice and truth. The laws are described as eternal principles that exist independently of human authority, which kings merely enforce. Renamu's innovation was not creating laws, but reinstating them after a period of chaos. The laws themselves are sophisticated, graduated punishments based on severity of offense, distinctions between intentional and accidental harm, protections for widows and orphans, regulations governing contracts and property. This is not primitive justice slowly evolving toward fairness. This is a mature legal system being restored after interruption. Even agriculture, the foundational technology of civilization, is described as gift rather than achievement. The Sumerian Farmer's Almanac, dating to around 1700 BC, provides detailed instructions for plowing, irrigation, harvesting, and threshing. But the opening lines credit the knowledge to Ninurta, who gave the plow to humanity and taught the planting of seed. The text does not describe trial and error, gradual learning, or experimental improvement. It presents agriculture as received wisdom, practiced correctly by following instructions that predate the farmers themselves. What emerges across all these domains is a consistent epistemological stance: knowledge existed before humans possessed it, and civilization's task is preservation, not discovery. Modern narratives describe progress as cumulative, each generation building on the last, errors corrected through experience, understanding deepening over time. But Mesopotamian texts describe something closer to recovery: fragments of older knowledge preserved through catastrophe, copied and recopied to prevent further loss, maintained even when the original context has been forgotten. The scribes understood this themselves. Colophon's marginal notes describing a tablet's provenance frequently include phrases like, "copied from the old text," "let no one alter it," "written according to ancient knowledge," "may it not be lost." These are not the words of innovators confident in their discoveries. These are the words of archivists terrified of forgetting. And if the knowledge was inherited rather than invented, if mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law were gifts transmitted from an earlier age, then the question becomes unavoidable. If this knowledge was inherited, why do other civilizations remember the same pattern? The global memory. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a papyrus scroll stretches nearly 6 feet long when unrolled. It was discovered in the early 19th century among royal archives at Thebes and catalogued as the Turin King List, dated to the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BC. The papyrus lists every pharaoh of Egypt in chronological order, beginning with the first dynasty around 3100 BC and working backward through time. But the list does not stop at human rulers. Before the first mortal pharaoh, the scribe records an earlier sequence: the reign of the gods. Ptah ruled for 9,000 years. Ra for 1,000 years. Shu, Jeb, Osiris, Set, and Horus each governed for centuries. Then came the Shamsu, who are the followers of Horus, semi-divine kings who bridge the age of gods and the age of men. Only after this extended divine chronology does the list transition to Narmer, the first historically recognized pharaoh, and the beginning of what Egyptologists accept as documented history. The papyrus treats both sections identically: same format, same formulaic language, same accounting precision. The scribe made no distinction between mythological rulers and historical ones. Both were recorded as factual succession. Both were considered legitimate links in an unbroken chain of governance. This was not symbolic genealogy. It was constitutional documentation. And Egypt was not alone in preserving such records. Across the ancient world, separated by oceans and millennia, civilizations independently described the same pattern: an earlier age governed by non-human beings, a catastrophic transition, and humanity inheriting a diminished world. The consistency is unsettling. In the Puranas, Hindu texts compiled between 300 and 1000 AD, but drawing on oral traditions far older, cosmic time is divided into yugas, vast epochs of declining order and increasing chaos. The Satya Yuga, the first age, lasted 1,728,000 years, and was characterized by perfect dharma, divine presence, and direct governance by the gods. Humans existed, but they did not rule. They lived under the administration of the devas, celestial beings who maintained cosmic law, regulated time, and taught the sacred sciences. The text describes this age not as paradise, but as ordered governance, a world where authority descended from higher realms and humans were recipients of knowledge, not its originators. Then the ages declined. The Treta Yuga saw divine presence diminish. The Dwapara Yuga brought further withdrawal. By the current age, the Kali Yuga, the gods have retreated entirely, and humanity governs itself in moral and spiritual decay, guided only by fragment memories of what was once clearly known. The structure mirrors the Sumerian king list precisely: divine rule, catastrophic transition, human governance operating in the shadow of a greater past. In Mesoamerica, the pattern repeats with different names but identical logic. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Kitch Maya, describes multiple failed attempts at creation before the current human age. Each previous world was governed by beings who were not quite human wooden people, mud people, incomplete forms that lacked the qualities necessary for true civilization. Then came the gods themselves: Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, who taught astronomy, agriculture, and calendar keeping. Quetzalcoatl among the Aztecs. Viracocha among the Inca. Each described as a teacher god who arrived from across the water or descended from the sky, established order, instructed humanity in the arts of civilization, and then departed with a promise to return. The Annals of Cuautitlan, an Aztec manuscript from the 16th century preserving pre-Columbian traditions, describes 5 previous world ages, each ending in catastrophe. The current age, the fifth sun, is the age of humanity, but it is explicitly described as temporary, destined to end as the previous ages did. What's striking is not the mythological content, but the historiographical treatment. Aztec chronologies recorded these cosmic ages alongside dynastic successions and historical events, using the same dating systems, the same narrative tone. The reign of Quetzalcoatl was not categorically different from the reign of later Teutonic emperors. Both were treated as legitimate rulers whose governance shaped civilization. In China, the pattern appears again. The Bamboo Annals, a chronological history compiled around 300 BC from texts reportedly discovered in an ancient tomb, begins with the reign of Yuangdi, the Yellow Emperor, around 2697 BC. But before him, the chronicle lists earlier rulers, the 3 sovereigns, who governed for thousands of years each, teaching agriculture, medicine, and governance. Fuxi, the first sovereign, was credited with revealing the I Ching, the hexagram system, used for divination and cosmological mapping. Shennong taught herbal medicine and agriculture. Niwa established marriage customs and social order. Each is described not as inventing these things, but as revealing or transmitting them knowledge that existed before human implementation. Later Confucian scholars struggled with these accounts. Were the 3 sovereigns literal beings or symbolic representations of cultural developments? The texts themselves refuse that distinction. They record reigns, list accomplishments, and treat these figures as historical administrators whose governance predated the first verifiable dynasties. Even in the Pacific, isolated island cultures preserve similar memories. Hawaiian tradition describes the Menehune, a race of master builders who constructed temples, fishponds, and roads before the arrival of Polynesian settlers. The structures attributed to them, like the Alakoko fishpond on Kauai, demonstrate engineering sophistication that seems disproportionate to the island's known settlement chronology. Maori oral histories speak of the Pachapayar, pale-skinned beings who possessed advanced knowledge and lived in New Zealand before the Polynesian migration. They withdrew into the forests and mountains as human settlement expanded, leaving behind only scattered remnants of their presence. These are not global myths clearly derived from a common source. They emerge from cultures with no documented contact, separated by geography and chronology. Yet they share structural elements that suggest not diffusion, but independent preservation of a pattern. Governance by non-human or semi-divine beings. Transmission of advanced knowledge. Catastrophic transition. Withdrawal of the earlier rulers. Humanity inheriting systems it did not create. The question is not whether these cultures borrowed from each other; the evidence for that is absent. The question is why they would independently develop the same narrative framework. One possibility: universal psychological archetypes, humanity's natural tendency to project authority onto imagined divine ancestors. But this explanation falters when confronted with specificity. The Egyptian Shamsuhor are not vague mythological figures. They are listed with reign lengths, associated with specific nomes, provinces, and credited with establishing legal and religious institutions that persisted into historical periods. The Mahabharata describes the weapons and flying machines of the gods with technical detail that reads less like fantasy and more like corrupted memory of technologies the authors could no longer replicate. The Sumerian tablets listing the Anunnaki's administrative assignments, who governed which city, who controlled which domain, are not archetypal stories. They are bureaucratic records, the kind of text civilizations produce when documenting actual governance structures. If these were purely symbolic, why were they treated with the same archival rigor as verifiable historical records? The ancient scribes, priests, and historians who preserved these accounts did not categorize them as mythology. They integrated them into chronologies, referenced them in legal arguments, used them to establish territorial claims and dynastic legitimacy. They treated pre-human rule not as metaphor, but as historical fact requiring documentation. And perhaps most tellingly, they described the end of that rule with profound loss, not liberation. The Egyptian texts lament the departure of the gods. The Hindu Puranas describe the declining yugas with nostalgia for divine governance. The Mesoamerican accounts anticipate Quetzalcoatl's return because his absence is experienced as abandonment. Even the biblical narrative, which reframes earlier traditions through monotheistic theology, preserves the memory of a time when heaven and earth were closer, when divine beings walked among humans, and when that proximity ended through catastrophe. These are not stories of humanity triumphantly seizing its destiny. They are stories of inheritance, remembrance, and the weight of maintaining what was given. If the pattern appears globally, preserved independently across cultures that developed in isolation, then either humanity possesses a universal psychological need to imagine divine prehistory, or the memory being preserved predates the divergence of these civilizations echoing something older than the cultures that remembered it. The texts themselves cannot answer this, but they preserve the question with uncomfortable consistency. If these memories were symbolic, why were they treated as historical truth by ancient peoples? Who were they? In 1976, linguist Samuel Noah Kramer published a translation of a Sumerian text that had been overlooked for decades in the archives of the University Museum in Philadelphia. The tablet, catalogued as Nai 4486, was a hymn to the city of Eridu, dated to approximately 2500 BC. Most of the text followed familiar patterns praising the city's sacred status, celebrating its temples, invoking divine protection. But one passage stopped Kramer mid-translation. When kingship was brought down from heaven, Eridu was chosen. The Anunnaki, who determined destinies, met together. Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag fashioned the black-headed people. The phrase fashioned the black-headed people appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature as a reference to humanity. But this text placed the action firmly in historical time after kingship descended, in the city of Eridu, by identifiable beings acting in council. This was not cosmic creation ex nihilo. This was something closer to establishment or organization, the Anunnaki shaping an existing population into a governed civilization. The question that has haunted Mesopotamian scholarship ever since is simple and unanswerable. Who were the Anunnaki? The term itself provides limited clarity. Linguistically, Anunnaki derives from an, heaven, and kai, earth, with Naki possibly indicating those other offspring of. The etymology suggests beings associated with both celestial authority and terrestrial presence, not purely divine, not purely human, but occupying some intermediary category. The Sumerians clearly distinguished them. Early translations rendered them as gods, collapsing the Anunnaki into conventional religious terminology. But the Sumerian concept of divinity was far more complex than later Western categories allowed. The word Dinger, often translated as God, could refer to celestial bodies, natural forces, deified ancestors, or powerful living individuals. It was not a theological term, but a designation of elevated status. The Anunnaki were Dinger, but so were successful kings, legendary heroes, and personified concepts like justice or wisdom. This ambiguity becomes crucial when examining how ancient peoples themselves understood these figures. One possibility: the Anunnaki represent deified ancestors, real human leaders whose accomplishments were magnified through oral tradition until they assumed mythological proportions. This interpretation has precedent. Egyptian pharaohs were deified upon death. Chinese emperors claimed divine mandate. Roman emperors were posthumously declared gods. If early Mesopotamian rulers established particularly successful dynasties, later generations might have elevated them into the pantheon, attributing civilization's foundations to their wisdom. The impossibly long reign lengths in the king list could represent dynastic totals or cultural memory compressed into individual figures. Alulum ruled 28,800 years might mean the Alulum dynasty governed for an epoch we can no longer precisely measure. The pre-flood kings become symbolic representatives of an entire era, rather than literal individuals. This explanation is tidy, but it struggles against specific textual details. The Anunnaki are never described dying. They do not have tombs. No royal cemetery claims to house their remains. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs or Chinese emperors, whose mortal deaths are carefully documented even as their divine status is proclaimed, the Anunnaki simply withdraw, transitioning from active governance to distant judgment without the biological interruption of death. And their knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, law, architecture appears too systematically developed to result from the random brilliance of individual rulers remembered through myth. The second possibility: the Anunnaki represent a lost elite culture or sophisticated civilization that either preceded the Sumerians or coexisted with them before being destroyed by catastrophe. This interpretation accounts for the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge without developmental stages. Perhaps the flood did not end human civilization entirely, but rather destroyed a specific culture whose survivors transmitted fragments of their knowledge to the populations that rebuilt afterward. The Anunnaki would then be cultural memory of this lost elite, remembered not as gods, but as the inheritors of an older, more sophisticated tradition that the post-flood populations could replicate, but not fully equal. Archaeological evidence offers ambiguous support. The pre-flood occupation layers of Eridu, Uruk, and other sites show architectural sophistication that seems disproportionate to the limited population estimates. The precision of astronomical observation suggests centuries of continuous measurement. The mathematical knowledge embedded in early tablets implies institutional education systems we cannot trace. But no distinctive material culture identifies these supposed elites. No separate burial practices, no unique pottery styles, no obvious discontinuity in the archaeological record beyond the flood layers themselves. A third possibility: the Anunnaki are mythic memory of governance itself, symbolic personifications of the abstract principles required to maintain civilization. In this reading, Enki represents hydraulic engineering and water management. Enlil embodies atmospheric order and agricultural cycles. Ninhursag personifies birth and biological continuity. Each Anunnaki becomes a conceptual category rather than an individual being, humanity's way of organizing and remembering the complex systems that make civilization possible. This interpretation has psychological appeal. Humans naturally personify abstract forces. We speak of justice as blind, fortune as fickle, death as a reaper. Perhaps the Anunnaki were similar cognitive tools, ways of conceptualizing and transmitting technical knowledge before the development of systematic science. Yet this explanation cannot account for the bureaucratic specificity of the texts. When tablets list which Anunnaki governed which city, record their administrative decisions, and describe their councils as resolving practical disputes, the language resists purely symbolic interpretation. Symbols do not meet to decide what are rights. Metaphors do not establish legal precedent. The texts describe actions, not attributes. The truth may be that certainty is impossible. The Sumerians themselves, writing 4,000 years ago, were already recording texts they described as copies of older sources. By the time we can read their accounts, the Anunnaki had already transitioned from active presence to distant memory. Whatever the Anunnaki were, deified ancestors, lost elite, symbolic framework, or something the evidence cannot yet accommodate, the Sumerians did not have direct access to the answer either. What they had was inheritance tablets copied from tablets, temples rebuilt on ancient foundations, laws enforced because they were considered eternal, a civilization organized around the principle that its greatest achievements belonged to the past. And perhaps that is what matters most, not the identity of the Anunnaki, but the fact that believing in them shaped everything that followed. If you believe your laws were given by beings wiser than yourself, you do not casually alter them. If you believe your cities were designed according to cosmic models, you maintain those designs with sacred precision. If you believe your knowledge was inherited from an earlier age, you focus on preservation rather than innovation. The Anunnaki, whether literal or symbolic, functioned as constitutional authority, a source of legitimacy that transcended any individual king or dynasty. They were the answer to the question, why should we govern this way? Because this is how it was done before. Because this is what was given to us. Because we are heirs, not founders. This belief system persisted for millennia. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon in the 6th century BC, he still described himself as restoring what the Anunnaki had established. When Assyrian kings conquered territories, they justified their rule by claiming to restore the divine order the Anunnaki had originally decreed. The memory outlasted empires. And that persistence suggests the question is not, were the Anunnaki real? But rather, what happens to a civilization that organizes itself around inherited authority? It becomes conservative in the deepest sense, dedicated to conservation, to maintaining what was given, to preventing further loss. Innovation happens not through bold departure from tradition, but through careful interpretation of ancient texts, trying to understand what the ancestors knew. Progress becomes recovery. Discovery becomes remembrance. And humanity lives not as the creators of its own destiny, but as the stewards of something older, responsible for passing it forward, even when the original meaning has grown dim. Living as heirs. What does it mean to live in a world you believe was inherited, not created for you? In 1986, archaeologists working in the ancient city of Sippar uncovered a clay tablet that had been deliberately buried in a foundation deposit beneath a temple wall. The tablet was dated to 550 BC, late in Mesopotamian history, when the region had already passed through Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian rule. The inscription was brief, ceremonial, the kind of text typically placed in cornerstones to commemorate construction. But one line disrupted the expected formulas. I have sought out the old foundation and built upon it. I have discovered the ancient writings and followed them exactly, that nothing may be lost. The king who commissioned this text, Nabonidus, was not celebrating innovation. He was confessing anxiety, a deep concern that something essential was slipping away, that the connection to older knowledge was fraying, and that his primary duty was not to surpass the past, but to prevent its complete disappearance. By the 6th century BC, Mesopotamian civilization had existed for over 3,000 years. Yet here, near the end of that long continuity, the king still defined his legitimacy through archaeology, through excavating older foundations and copying older texts, as though the true source of authority remained buried in a past he could access only through fragments. This was not the confidence of a civilization at its height. This was the posture of inheritors managing decline. And perhaps it had always been. If we step back and view Mesopotamian civilization not as a singular culture, but as a long sequence of recoveries, a different pattern emerges, not progress building toward greater complexity, but cycles of knowledge rising, catastrophe striking, and fragments being salvaged to rebuild. The archaeological record bears this out. After the flood layers around 2900 BC, cities rebuilt, writing re-emerged, temples rose on ancient foundations. But within a few centuries, the early dynastic period collapsed into warfare and fragmentation. Akkadian conquest followed, briefly unifying the region before its own sudden collapse around 2200 BC, coinciding with severe drought documented in climate records. The third dynasty of Ur restored order around 2100 BC, but it too fell within a century to invasion and internal collapse. Each recovery reached back to older sources, copying ancient texts, restoring old temples, invoking the authority of the Anunnaki to legitimize new dynasties. Knowledge did not accumulate smoothly. It resurged, then faded, then resurged again. One tablet from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BC, contains a scribal lament. The old writings are damaged. The ancient knowledge grows dim. We copy what we can understand and preserve what we cannot. The scribe was acknowledging that even in his time, still within what we consider ancient history, much had already been lost. He was working with sources he could not fully interpret, preserving them mechanically, because their authority was recognized even when their meaning was obscure. This is the pattern that defines post-flood civilization: custodianship of inheritance poorly understood. Consider what the Mesopotamians preserved across millennia. Mathematical tablets solving problems that would not re-emerge in Western mathematics until the Renaissance. Astronomical tables tracking planetary cycles over centuries. Medical diagnostic procedures that presuppose systematic empirical observation. Legal codes balancing individual rights and social order with philosophical sophistication. None of this knowledge shows steady linear development. It appears, persists through careful copying, occasionally expands, then contracts during periods of collapse, only to be revived when stability returns. The historical trajectory is not an upward curve, but a wave cresting, breaking, reforming. And always, the reforming required looking backward. When Hammurabi codified laws around 1750 BC, his prologue explicitly states he was restoring justice as it was in the days of old. When Ashurbanipal built his great library at Nineveh in the 7th century BC, he dispatched scholars across the empire to find and copy ancient tablets, prioritizing preservation over composition. The entire civilization operated on the assumption that the highest wisdom belonged to the past. But here is the question that haunts this perspective. If knowledge could be lost so completely that later generations preserved texts they could not fully understand, would it already been lost before the first tablet was written? The Sumerian king list begins with kingship descending from heaven, but it does not describe what preceded that descent. The Ritu Genesis mentions the Anunnaki creating order, but it does not explain what existed before chaos was organized. There is always an earlier stratum the texts reference, but cannot access. Temple foundation deposits contain tablets describing buildings as restorations of structures from before the flood, but no architectural plans survive from that year. Medical texts cite procedures according to ancient practice, but the experiments and observations that develop those practices are absent from the record. The earliest accessible sources are already pointing backward to something older. This suggests that what we call Sumerian civilization might itself have been a recovery, the reconstruction of an earlier order, whose details were already fading when the first cuneiform tablets were pressed into clay. And if that is true, then human history as we understand it begins not at the beginning, but in the middle of a much longer story. What came before writing? The texts say knowledge was given. Laws descended from heaven. Demi existed before humans practiced them. Whether this reflects literal transmission from an earlier culture, symbolic memory of a lost developmental phase, or something the evidence cannot yet accommodate, the belief itself shaped everything that followed. Mesopotamian civilization did not organize itself around conquest, expansion, or innovation. It organized itself around memory, the sacred duty to preserve what had been entrusted, to maintain what had been established, to prevent further loss. This is why ziggurats were rebuilt in exactly the same form for millennia. Why mathematical formulas were copied without alteration, even when their applications were forgotten. Why legal codes invoked ancient authority rather than royal decree. Why scribes spent their lives copying tablets from older tablets, preserving texts whose purpose was no longer clear. The culture was not static. It adapted to new challenges, responded to invasions, developed new technologies. But it never claimed these adaptations as original achievements. Every innovation was framed as recovery, every advancement as restoration of what had been. Perhaps this is what it means to live as heirs rather than founders. You do not casually discard what you believe was given. You do not experiment recklessly with systems you did not design. You recognize that your understanding is partial, that those who came before possessed knowledge you have not recovered, and that your primary responsibility is not to surpass them, but to transmit what remains. The weight of this worldview is visible in the texts themselves. When Assyrian scribes described their libraries, they did not boast of new compositions, they catalogued how many ancient tablets they had recovered. When kings dedicated temples, they did not celebrate architectural innovation, they confirmed alignment with older foundations. When physicians treated patients, they cited authorities whose names reached back through generations into prehistory. Authority flowed backward, towards sources that grew increasingly remote but nevertheless binding. And absence to gaps in knowledge, the texts that were damaged, the practices that could no longer be performed, correctly shaped the culture more powerfully than presence. The Anunnaki's withdrawal created the vacuum that defined Mesopotamian civilization. They were remembered not for what they did while present, but for what their absence meant, a world that once operated more smoothly, more justly, with greater clarity than it now did. Every ritual was an attempt to maintain connection to that vanished order. Every temple was a physical link to divine architecture. Every copied tablet was resistance against complete forgetting. This is not mythology in the sense of comforting stories told around fires. This is organized cultural memory deployed as constitutional framework, the past functioning as the permanent government under which all temporary human rulers operated. And the past, in this system, always wins. Even when empires fell, even when languages changed, even when populations were displaced and cities abandoned, the texts survived, buried in foundation deposits, archived in temple libraries, copied and recopied until the knowledge they contained outlasted the civilizations that produced them. Perhaps humanity's first role was never mastery, but remembrance. Not the triumphant march toward progress, but the patient, uncertain work of preserving fragments from a world that ended before we fully understood it. Each generation passing forward what it inherited, adding what it could, losing what it must, hoping the next generation would understand more than they did. And if we are heirs to a forgotten world, standing in the aftermath of an age we can no longer fully reconstruct, then the question becomes uncomfortably contemporary. If we are heirs to a forgotten world, what will future civilizations believe we once knew and lost?